Hi everybody. I hope everyone's doing well today. For starters, I might be referencing and reading because there's a lot of textual things and I just know I will mess it up if I don't focus in on this. So if it feels kind of lectury, I'm really sorry. But welcome to my show. My show is called Double Entendre. And I want to give some thanks to Hillier for supporting this project. And because this project was produced in tandem with a grant that I received, support for Double Entendre has been provided by the 2025 Gay Cultural Studies Research and Creativity Grant. The Gay Cultural Studies Research and Creativity Grant supports faculty and student research under the College of Arts and Letters at Old Dominion University, supporting research, creative projects, and academics on LGBTQ+ topics. It's really important that I give thanks to them because they supported a large portion of this project. I'd also like to dedicate this talk to the late Samuel Garrison III, a politician, legal aid, and advocate for LGBTQ+ rights in Virginia. I read about his contributions in a story on Our Own Press, and through research, was really eye-opening and inspiring to see such a multifaceted person that worked through red tape while also giving back to the community. And I encourage you to read and learn more about him and his legacy at a later time, just kind of an anecdotal note. So the core of my practice is centered on research regarding the intersections of queerness, labor, and environmental practices. And my work challenges these phenomena in research topics in a comparative analysis that questions our assumptions about the aesthetics, built environments, and socio-political state of labor in queer bodies. I draw inspirations from the ways that public narrative undermines data, symbols, images, and text as testimony of progressive knowledge, hiding in plain sight, offering a glimpse of the human condition. The core of my studio practice is in printmaking, but I also work in sculpture, craft, glass, all these other sort of sensibilities that you kind of see in the space. But I always kind of view these practices through the lens of printmaking. So whether I'm working with fiber or with glass, I'm thinking about them as prints or through print history. I also think that the sort of research I'm doing where I'm looking at lots of images, lots of data, lots of ephemera, that it's better to kind of frame my work as anchored within print history. And so much of my material research as a printmaker has involved teasing out the syntax or pairings between image and materiality and the poetics of it. So I think thinking through this sort of materiality in this work, it kind of ties neatly these ideas of ecology, of labor, of the built environment, globalization, and printmaking kind of is an umbrella that sort of surfaces the whole thing. One of the ways this research has surfaced is stemmed from an incidental lung nodule that was found in my lungs in a CT scan in fall of 2022. Through testing and diagnosis, it was revealed that I had some residual glass powders embedded in my lungs as a result of improper personal protective equipment when learning various glass processes. I began working in glass in graduate school at Tyler School of Art and Architecture as an elective and was really kind of hooked on the material possibilities of that medium. So I kind of developed this sort of love for this medium that, of course, when you find out you have a long-term condition from making work that I love, I now have to monitor this for the rest of my life, and it kind of put me in a tizzy that has surfaced my mind over the past few years. What this sort of has done is prompted me to do research on the history of silicosis, which is a long-term disease from exposure to silica, and that's primarily when glass is ground up into powders. Glass workers that do a lot of cold working, work in mines, mold makers, they can develop this condition from years of exposure. But it's also seen in other professions such as miners, quarry workers, stone workers, and fabricators. As a result of health exposures to this medium, OSHA has stepped in to kind of develop new policy and guidelines around these industries. And that has sort of become a research topic in of itself that has surfaced in this work. So here's kind of a picture of the silica mines. You know, the workers might be down in there in these sort of tight conditions, and if they're not using the appropriate PPE where the dust kind of goes in their lungs, that is irreversible damage that can essentially be this long-term debilitating condition. So one of the ways that I see my work as an artist is that some of my previous projects have included research and topics about queerness, such as aesthetics and representation, and this sort of phenomena forced me to consider how something such as class or labor, the silica mines, and the health effects of queer bodies, the AIDS crisis, are connected via its public image. My desire to sort of complicate or tease out these research points stems from sort of two things in my personal life. One, that I've worked so many blue-collar jobs my entire life. You know, I worked as a project manager in fabrication for 5 years in the signage industry, and then I was also a lifeguard and landscaper for most of my teen and college years. And the second thing being that this health scare that I have with this lung nodule came from a place of love. It came from working in the studio with the material that, you know, essentially gave me this sort of health effect. And I was thinking about how that's very similar to the HIV/AIDS crisis, how this infectious disease could possibly come from a place of love or desire. And that was really sort of captivating for me to kind of begin this research. For developing this work, I really wanted to include research from voices and testimonies from folks firsthand. And I figured relying on archival research that this would be fit for the development of this work, focusing specifically on stories of people that have actually experienced these phenomena. And so in building this work, I focused on three specific sites or sources that have helped me build this sort of body of art. One being Our Own Press, which is a community newspaper in Norfolk. The AIDS Library of Philadelphia, which is a public library focused on HIV/AIDS outreach. And OSHA cases and court documents on the National Archives, focusing on lung and workers' health. And I want to go over kind of how each of these sort of research points have kind of manifested in the works more subliminally rather than like a didactic way. So the first one being Our Own Press. Our Own Press was a community-based newspaper that ran from 1976 to 1978. It was started by a handful of queers within the Unitarian Universalist Church in Norfolk, and they called themselves the Unitarian Universalist Gay Caucus. The newspaper focused on specific articles and testimonies related to queer politics in the US, HIV and AIDS activism, as well as general happenings in the Norfolk and the greater Richmond area in Virginia. What I kind of noticed when I was looking through these sort of research is that there was a lot of dichotomy of love and fear in reading of these sort of stories. Specifically looking at like this one, which are two articles in the same newspaper. One that's talking about a court order that forces this father to take a blood test during the HIV/AIDS crisis, and then next to another story about Samuel Garrison, who's talking about community building within the state of Virginia. And I found that that was very sort of consistent across all readings of the paper, and that sort of up and down, high, low, love and fear sort of sine wave that was happening was really captivating and really kind of a space that I wanted to foster within the work. And I felt it was important to make a work that kind of straddled both of these. And that's where the titular work in the piece in the show, Felt, Flocked, and Folded, comes in. Felt, Flocked, and Folded is a massive print of a medical drawing of a skeleton that is overlaid with custom stickers of butterflies. The diagram is printed on brushed Dibond, a material often used in office placards and museum displays, but could be mimicked to reference a solar panel, a piece of technology that utilizes glass and research extraction to make it. The butterflies on the surface are gathered in the heart and stomach area of the medical illustration, considering how fear and love are felt in these areas of the body at the same time. The choice of a butterfly as an icon is inspired by their ecological nesting and herding characteristics, as well as the duality of them being a symbol of climate change and queerness. The panels are mounted to solar panel hinges and tilted at various angles. The reflective surface casts light, body, and position as materials of the work in itself. And these are spatial considerations the work embodies as we are confronted with the work. So when I was making this, I was thinking about the solar panel system and how captivating the grid and the sort of expansiveness of it was, and then thinking about how this sort of reflective surface casts all these different materials just by your body, space, and position. When I was thinking about this talk and how I'd present this work, this is very sculptural for me because of that relationship to the body. And I think these two pieces that are on these hinges forces me to think about these works more as sculpture than they are prints. One of the sort of caveats or sort of Easter eggs I want to include is that this piece has a direct sort of appropriation to a comic that was in Our Own Press, which was this sort of comic that was talking about testing and the yes-no flower being a really sort of prominent icon in that comic, and thinking about how we think about, when we have a diagnosis or we have a scare, like that desire to go or not, and that sort of internal debate that you have with yourself within the medical field. So I decided to kind of include that in the work. The AIDS Library of Philadelphia. So the AIDS Library of Philadelphia is the first and only public lending library in the world dedicated to AIDS and HIV research and outreach. Located in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, the AIDS Library of Philly organized information pamphlets, ephemera, and resources related to AIDS crisis in the United States. So this is hosted at Temple University's Special Collections. They have their entire sort of boxes of ephemera that they kind of dig through, and I spent a few days looking through everything in their archive, which is like 36 boxes, so I spent a lot of time there. But I think what was really interesting to me was that there was some of these things that are kind of pamphlets, like, for example, the one on the left is, a fact document that was kind of used and disseminated in the public, next to these sort of like more governmental reports that were collected and like housed in this space. Here's like another example within that archive, like, the one on the right, a guide to locating information about HIV/AIDS in the city, next to these more sort of generalized, like easily more digestible graphics. And some of the things that the Philly AIDS Library did would be like, they would go to like Camden, which is like right on the other side of Philadelphia, and would provide dial-up connection to people so that they can have access to information and resources. And then there's also these sort of more textual things, like that's a very clearly a government document and data that I have no idea how to decipher, and I have to kind of like amateurly figure out like what this thing is talking about. And that sort of experience, I was approaching a lot of this research from like how the human might feel if they were trying to digest this and understand this. And then also within archives, you never know what you're gonna find. So this was like a government report that was talking about like T4 cell count, and it was like duplicated, printed over this like crossword puzzle that was about like monuments. And I was like, why is this in this sort of archive? But I was really captivated by this, and I was thinking about how, when I was deciphering this is that sort of abstract bodily thinking you think about when you maybe like if you log into your patient portal from your doctors and you see all these tests and you're like, how do I figure this out? This sort of experience is very similar to that, and I took that as an inspiration in making the work Sucker here. So Sucker is a work that is inspired by deciphering of this data, pulling inspiration from the misprint in the archive. I placed a large crossword puzzle with no key or directions over top of a microscopic image of lung scarring tissue. Following a similar solar panel-like system, the glittering nature of the panels and the directionality of the work, creating a V shape. When I was building this, I was thinking it's very similar to like a wardrobe that you might step into, where you might have mirrors on either side of you. Paired with the abstract syntax of the diagrammatic against evidence, creates visual language similar to figuring out a medical record. What you read isn't necessarily how you feel. And oftentimes, the patient is lost or confronted with the reality of that situation. So I was thinking about that when I was making these works. The National Archives. So one of the directions my research took is also looking through the National Archives. This direction was really important because many of the documents that are stored there are memos, OSHA case studies, these more sort of direct government testimonials that have informed this work as I was making it. And the thing about them is that they can be really dense and hard to kind of understand and sparse through. I think when you're looking through the National Archives, you're looking at this massive field that you're then trying to find very specific information. And there's kind of a variety of things when you're looking through there. So, for example, these are maybe the most digestible samples that I found. One of these is an excerpt on, labor struggle, and then the other one is union contract and bylaws for these, mold and minor unions. And so that became really interesting to kind of read about like how these systems and organizations are structured. But then you might also see like memo notes in a letter written to a senator ahead of a meeting. So this one specifically is talking about the compensation of workers who were affected by diseases or hazardous conditions and how they are kind of deciphering or parsing through that. So there's this sort of push and pull between these like ideas of corporations and then these ideas of unions and how they kind of intersect and the ways that they almost function like pillars to uphold the public image. And that's where this middle table piece in the middle, advocacy examinations from capitals and memorials comes in. This table piece is constructed to consider that sort of relationship and is made from laser cut symbols that act as literal pillars and holding these sort of smaller gestural ideas up. So like if you're looking at the legs of this table, we have the American bald eagle, the bull from Wall Street, the medical snakes on the staff, and the support ribbon as physical pillars that then hold this sort of system up in the same way that these documents I'm looking at are like government documents that then talk about these union sort of bullet points. And so I was thinking about when I was how to display these smaller works, it was really apparent that the table had to be informed rather than just kind of putting them on like a pedestal. And so some of the items on there, I mean, there's various different things. We have these like blown glass structures that are kind of more abstract. We have like the urn in the middle that has the word forever sandblasted on it with the two rings. Like that's this kind of poetic way of thinking about love and desire and like liminality and finality. We have like the cell phone that's sandblasted with the integral symbol, which is like a mathematics symbol that talks about where things are derived. And so there's a whole bunch of different sort of array of gestures that I try to kind of lead people in different ways of how I'm thinking about this work. But one of the prominent pieces on there that I wanted to talk about is the quilt, which is a piece that I made called Unions, but I decided was ultimately absorbed into how it's presented right here. And this is made from patchwork t-shirt transfers. So when I was piecing together through this textual information, I was looking at a lot of graphics, a lot of advocacy groups. And so I was scanning them in, kind of recoloring them for these fabric scraps, and then like pressing them onto fabrics. And essentially what I'm making is this like interlocking network between this like queer advocacy and then this like blue collar advocacy, but ultimately come under the umbrella of like activism. And then it kind of creates this union that it's like one sort of fabric piece. And this is also sort of a subtle nod to the AIDS crisis and thinking about like the AIDS quilt. And that's something I really wanted to, kind of instill with these works, is that there's subtle nods to all these different things, such as glass, printed ephemera, the AIDS quilt, the production of things. And that was really important with this work. And then sort of lastly, to kind of sum up this talk is, in developing this work, I really wanted to have these sort of more abstract painting works. I started painting, and this is the first time in my career I'm doing that, and thinking about the difference between, structure and gesture and how those two things kind of work together. And so these two pieces are first sort of attempts in thinking about how, I might take this textual data, abstract it, and then work gesturally and work through density and layering to then kind of complicate this structure idea. But a good example of this, the way that this gestural mark making could be paired with this imagery and fibers is the piece on the wall that's called A Red Flag in a Field. And this work is made by screen printing some of the graphics I'm looking at, and then layering it with this sort of structure and density, but then also kind of embedding the fiber on the surface as well, and thinking about how this might be an anecdote or like a side conversation with these other works. So yeah, I'll read the artist statement because I think that's the best way I can kind of talk about this work, and then I'll leave it at that. But Double Entendre is a body of work that cross-examines policy, health, and anthropological studies around the AIDS crisis and resource extraction, focusing primarily on silica and mining industries. By studying these seemingly disparate situations, I use my research and creative practice to interrogate these boundaries and assumptions about the complexities between the connotations of queer and blue collar. This work looks inwards towards the intersections of these two identities to further understand its position socially, graphically, through data, archives, and images. This body of work is grounded conceptually in printmaking, fiber, and glass art practices, creating historical nods to the infographic pamphlet, the AIDS quilt, the Union t-shirt, and production glass. Double Entendre responds somatically to stories of love and labor around these phenomena, positioning care and communication as critical resource survival in the face of health and policy. And that's my talk. Thank you for listening.